It's Friday, April 27th. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Wendy Rhodes.
And I'm Colin Marston. This week, scientists say they and their research are under attack.
We were talking to a researcher a couple weeks back who got a death threat on Twitter because of his climate research.
Some New York politicians are calling to legalize marijuana. They say keeping the drug illegal has a disproportionate impact on communities of color.
We have white folks also engaged with marijuana possession. We don't see these people getting arrested.
New wireless technology could make your cell phone's internet speed 10 times faster, but there's a trade-off. To get those speeds, we need many more cell phone towers.
People want to have cell reception, but they don't want to see ugly towers everywhere.
All this and more on Uptown Radio. First, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. President Trump is applauding today's historic talks between North and South Korea, whose leaders pledged to work toward denuclearizing the peninsula. Trump says he's looking forward to talks with the North's Kim Jong-un in the coming weeks. On the matter of Iran, Trump was asked during his joint news conference with visiting German Chancellor Angela Merkel if he would use military force should the U.S. withdraw from the international nuclear pact with Iran.
I don't talk about whether or not I'd use military force. It's not appropriate to be talking about. But I can tell you this, they will not be doing nuclear weapons. That I can tell you. Okay? They're not going to be doing nuclear weapons. You can bank on it.
Trump also called on NATO allies to increase their defense spending. A federal judge has tossed out a civil case brought by former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, challenging the special counsel's authority in the Russia investigation. NPR's Ryan Lucas says the judge ruled Manafort's concerns can be addressed in the ongoing criminal case.
Manafort filed the civil lawsuit in January against the Justice Department and special counsel Robert Mueller, alleging that Mueller had exceeded his authority by probing matters unrelated to the 2016 election. Manafort's lawyers later scaled back those claims and have since asked the court to protect Manafort from future prosecutions by the special counsel. The Justice Department has called the lawsuit frivolous and asked for it to be dismissed. In her 24-page ruling, Judge Amy Berman Jackson did just that, throwing out Manafort's civil case and declaring that his concerns about the special counsel's investigation will be taken up in the ongoing criminal case. Manafort has pleaded not guilty to conspiracy, money laundering, and other charges. Ryan Lucas, NPR News, Washington.
Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren is pointedly asking the man running the nation's consumer financial watchdog if he's doing the bidding of the industries he's supposed to be policing. Warren, an architect of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, sent a letter to Acting Chief Mick Mulvaney following remarks he made this week about lobbyists. Here's NPR's Chris Arnold.
Mulvaney told a group of bankers and lobbyists that when he was a Republican congressman, he'd only talk to lobbyists who gave money to his campaign. He also said he'd talk to anyone from his district regardless of contributions, but the lobbyist comments are drawing sharp criticism from Democrats, as have moves by Mulvaney to pull back on regulation at the Consumer Protection Bureau. Senator Warren told Mulvaney in a letter, quote, "Almost every one of your major decisions at the CFPB has fulfilled a request of a lobbying organization that has donated tens of thousands of dollars to your political campaigns." Warren is asking the CFPB's ethics office about excluding Mulvaney from decisions involving companies that gave money. Mulvaney has said campaign contributions do not pose a conflict of interest for him. Chris Arnold, NPR News.
You're listening to NPR News.
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Stevie Hertz. Two more Republican members of the New York State Senate are dropping out of the race for re-election. Senate Deputy Majority Leader John DeFrancisco of Syracuse and Mount Hope Senator John Bonasic announced today that they would not run in November. Yesterday, Senator Kathy Marchione of Half Moon also said that she would not seek another term. The Republicans lost 2 seats earlier this week in special elections, but still control the Senate by 1 vote. The killer of 2 New York City police officers over 45 years ago is set to be released from prison on parole this afternoon. In 1971, Herman Bell, along with 2 others, shot the officers after bringing them to Harlem with a false 911 call. The move to release Bell on parole comes after an appeals court denied the police union's request for a temporary restraining order to keep him behind bars. There will be no fare rises for NJ Transit riders until at least July 2019, Governor Phil Murphy said today. He also announced that he would triple the service's funding. Previously, Governor Murphy has called NJ Transit a national disgrace. Governor Murphy is also set to issue a statewide proclamation tomorrow announcing Danny DeVito Day. From this year onwards, November 17th, the actor's birthday, will be named after the star of Taxi, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and Matilda. In Central Park, it's currently 53 degrees and cloudy. That's set to continue this weekend as temperatures rise to the mid-60s. As we'll hear later in the show, tomorrow is the Seeker Culture Society Parade, with road closures across Midtown. Stevie Hertz, Columbia Radio News.
Every New Yorker dreams of living in a rent-stabilized apartment, but the price is going up. The New York City Rent Guidelines Board met last night to propose the second increase in 4 years.
I spoke with Sarah Stefanski of the Independent Budget Office to get a feel for why the city believes the increases are justified.
Landlords have costs to operate buildings, and if rents don't cover those costs, then buildings can deteriorate and might not be as well maintained. Landlords were asking for higher rent increases than 0.75%. They were citing property taxes, utility costs, which is water, gas, insurance costs, repair costs.
So what's the benefit to have a rent-stabilized apartment that doesn't pay you enough to even maintain it?
There are some landlords who buy rent-stabilized properties with the intention of, at some point, these apartments will deregulate and be taken out of rent stabilization, and then they can charge market rates. They're in it for the long game.
So that's actually really interesting. So you said that some landlords start with a rent-stabilized apartment and then they move to a market rent apartment. How does that happen?
A unit remains rent-stabilized until it hits a certain rent threshold and is vacated by the current tenant. Then a landlord can petition to the state to deregulate the apartment.
How does how New York City offers rent-stabilized apartments differ from other major cities?
So having rent stabilization or rent control is not common to most U.S. cities. We do see it in particularly California cities. So San Francisco has a rent control program, but nationwide it's not very common.
So if other major cities aren't necessarily relying on rent stabilization to keep housing affordable, why is New York City still using it?
It's a very political answer. So here's my radio answer. It does provide a level of housing that keeps rent increases from massively shifting. Although rent stabilization is not specifically affordable housing, these apartments are an avenue for people to afford housing in New York City because they tend to rent below market rates.
Gotcha. Okay, terrific. So my last question is, what can either landlords or renters who want to speak out about this issue do?
The final vote is happening on June 26th, and I encourage people to go to the Rent Guidelines Board website and look for public meetings, several of which are open to public testimony.
We've been talking to Sarah Stefanski from the New York City Independent Budget Office. Sarah, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Senator Chuck Schumer recently announced a bill to decriminalize marijuana across the country. And in New York, gubernatorial candidate Cynthia Nixon, public advocate Letitia James, and other politicians are calling for legalization.
At the core of their new policies is the idea that marijuana prohibition mainly hurts communities of color. That's something activists have been claiming for a long time. Juliette Jibkiro has more.
Anthony Posada was 17 when NYPD officers stopped him in the streets of Jackson Heights, Queens.
The officers have their guns in my face, and I'm worried about the guns going off, and they're saying, where are the drugs? And they're going into my pockets, and they're searching them. They finally come and find a bag that I had inside of one of the pockets inside my jacket, and they said, here it is, the marijuana, we found it, we got you.
Another Latino teenager arrested for marijuana possession. Posada says the cops handcuffed him and took him to the local precinct. That was the beginning of a long wait.
I felt crushed. It was a moment where I noticed the immense power that is in the hands of the police, and I felt bullied, belittled, humiliated.
But the worst part, according to Posada, was when they took him to court. The judge gave him a year of probation. His case would remain open. That meant he could not apply for college.
I'm not born into wealth, My family's first generation immigrants in this country. I'm the first one to graduate from high school. So financial aid was crucial.
To get federal funding for college, you have to fill out a form. And you have to check a box if you have been convicted of a drug-related offense. If you check that box, you're not getting any funding. Posada was lucky. After 1 year of probation, the judge dismissed his charges. He went to college and after that to law school. But many never get that chance. And that kind of arrest is common in New York.
Most of the arrests that we have here in New York are for very low-level possession, for small amount of marijuana.
That's Christopher Alexander. He works with the Drug Policy Alliance, a nonprofit that advocates for legalization.
People don't end up going to jail for that as much as they end up getting arrested and held overnight and then released. But the record stays.
Alexander says the problem with marijuana prohibition is that it gives police officers an easy excuse to arrest people.
Since this plant is prohibited and since so many people use this plant, it is easy for law enforcement to come into somebody and say, okay, well, I smell marijuana, now I want to search you. Or I thought I saw you smoking marijuana, I want to ask you questions.
And in New York, smelling weed is not rare.
And the smell is everywhere. So, it's a problem.
But even though marijuana is widely used by New Yorkers of all origins, the arrests seem to be targeted at certain communities. Roy Gadsden is a former police officer, and he's with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
We have white folks also engaged with marijuana possession. We don't see these people getting arrested.
The people getting arrested are people of color. Last year, they were making up to 86% of the people arrested for marijuana possession in the Fifth Degree in New York, according to NYPD data. For Gloria Braun-Marshall, law professor at John Jay College, there is nothing new about that.
When it comes to marijuana, yes, there is historical disparate treatment when it comes to people of color and African Americans and Latinos in particular.
And there is another problem. For Braun-Marshall, it's not just about stopping the arrests. It's about what's going to happen for people who have already been arrested or convicted.
I want to know whether or not those people who have records for possession of marijuana are going to have those records expunged.
And so far, according to a recent survey conducted by Marijuana Business Daily, more than 80% of marijuana businesses in the country are owned by white people. Braun-Marshall says that's another proof of the gap that exists between communities.
You have people who are have records for possession of marijuana and can't get jobs, can't go to certain schools, can't get loans for schools, etc., because they have a drug crime on their record. And at the same time, you have people making millions upon millions of dollars off of marijuana.
For her and for Anthony Posada, the lawyer who was arrested when he was a teenager, the most urgent thing is to help those who already have arrest records.
You know how many thousands of people are walking around with marijuana convictions who cannot move on with their life?
Governor Cuomo has announced that the State Department of Health is currently studying the legalization of marijuana in New York State. No word yet on arrest records, and there is no official date for the release of the results. Juliette Jepkirou, Columbia Radio News.
New wireless technologies are poised to reshape the internet yet again. In labs, researchers are clocking internet speeds 10 times faster than current cellular connections.
But just because it works in a lab doesn't mean 5G is ready for the streets. To bridge this gap, academics are testing out the tech in Harlem. You wouldn't expect it, but there's politics mixed up in it too. Cassiana McClanahan reports.
The next generation of cellular technology, called 5G, is going to be super fast. Like, download 100 high-definition movies at once fast. Ted Rappaport is a professor in both radiology and electrical and computer engineering at NYU. He spoke at the Brooklyn 5G Summit earlier this week about this technology's future. He thinks 5G's speedier connections will bring people closer together through seamless virtual experiences in fields ranging from medicine,
doctors doing remote surgery on their cell phone to people hundreds of miles away,
to more intimate interactions.
Grandma, here's your daughter and your grandkids sitting around with you in your living room on a 3D platform, and you feel like you're right there with them, even though they're across the world.
To create these connections, 5G uses higher radio frequencies. But those shorter radio waves don't travel very far. And they can also be blocked by things as flimsy as trees or raindrops. In theory, with enough base stations, carriers could still blanket a city with 5G coverage. Gil Zussman is an electrical engineering professor at Columbia University. He says exactly how that will happen hasn't been worked out yet.
No one actually took it out to the streets and covered, a big chunk of a city and tested these technologies with, people moving around, really trying to use it for some kind of applications. All of those things will be tested there.
The National Science Foundation has granted researchers $22 million to do that. Zussman is standing in a conference room 14 floors up, surveying the buildings of West Harlem through floor-to-ceiling windows. The blocks below are a jumble of Columbia buildings and public housing, sliced down the middle by the elevated 1 subway track. This complexity is part of why the team chose the area. They want to see how 5G's radio waves will flow around this landscape.
Wireless transmissions propagate like a wave. You throw a stone into the water, you see the wave propagating. Right? So if you look downstairs and you try to propagate between teachers' college and the subway and so on, things will bounce off walls and will become more complicated.
To test the technology, researchers are planning to install 50 cell sites in this 1 square mile of Harlem.
People want to have cell reception, but they don't want to see ugly towers everywhere.
Angelina Panettiere works on telecommunications policy for the National League of Cities, a municipal advocacy organization. She says that when this technology goes live, that testbed density could quadruple, since each cell carrier will need to have a radio on every city block. Traditionally, cities have been able to regulate cell tower aesthetics and access to public assets, like light poles or municipal buildings. But telecoms companies are now lobbying state governments and federal regulators to override those local considerations.
They're looking at limiting what cities can charge for rent for access to public property. They're also looking at limiting how long cities can take on considering applications.
These efforts are part of carriers' race to lock up equipment sites. They're all looking ahead towards coming competition over which one has the best 5G network. The West Harlem testbed will be ready to go in a year and a half and will run for 3 years after that. 5G-enabled phones are expected to hit the shelves in 2019. Cassiana McClenahan, Columbia Radio News.
And now for a slice of New York.
You heat the maple syrup to a certain temperature and stir it a long time, and it turns into a cream. My name is Dave Holscher. I'm the 7th generation in the farming business, selling maple syrup down here at Columbia University. The old-timers used to call it maple butter.
Oh, yeah?
I'm here at the Thursday Farmers Market in the spring and the fall. So I just do this when the students are here. The students aren't so into the syrup. They certainly want the maple cream soda and the maple lemon ginger beer and the maple popcorn. This is the first day that it's actually sunny. It's rained on me every single time, so that always hurts sales and people coming out. So this is a wonderful day.
Scientists say they are under attack. President Trump has proposed drastic cuts to federal science programs. He also recently withdrew from an international climate agreement. And advocates say he appointed an Environmental Protection Agency director that believes climate change is a hoax.
Those scientists are now taking off their lab coats and heading to the streets. Bo Hamby has more.
It was the first sunny Saturday of spring, and hundreds of New Yorkers were standing in Washington Square Park. But they weren't there for the sun. They were there to take part in what is now a yearly event under the Trump administration, the March for Science. And before they marched down Broadway, the marchers listened to supporters like Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer.
You are here because you know it is all of our responsibility to stand up and say facts matter, ignorance is not a solution.
And there were other defenders of science, like Lauren Kurtz. Kurtz is the executive director of the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. The Defense Fund provides scientists with legal support when they or their work are attacked. Kurtz's organization also partnered with the Columbia University Law School on the Silencing Science Tracker. They've been tracking government attempts to restrict science since Trump's inauguration. At the march, she gave the crowd a glimpse of what they're dealing with now.
Since November 2016, we've counted 126 of these incidents. 126!
A week after the march, I met Kurtz back at her office on the Upper West Side. She says the tracker looks at incidents of government censorship, budget cuts, and fake facts. But those aren't the only problems scientists come to her with.
They get nasty hate mail. We were talking to a researcher a couple weeks back who got a death threat on Twitter because of his climate research.
She says they've even helped a scientist get a restraining order. And the Defense Fund also deals with threats from Congress.
We're working with someone who right now is being targeted by an, I'll just say, climate denier in Congress and facing an investigation because of his research that supports the evidence for climate change.
And all of these attacks, the death threats and investigations, it's been piling up.
We get between 1 and 4 a week, depending on the week. So
that seems like a lot.
It is definitely a lot.
And work at the Defense Fund got really busy when Trump took office.
We're getting a lot more queries saying things like, the Trump administration has told me I can't publish my report that contains the words climate change. What can I do?
There's not a lot Kurtz or her clients can do. If the scientist is a federal employee, they have to follow the administration's rules. So instead of putting up a fight in the lab, scientists are taking to the streets. Kathy Barker knows that chant well. She's a microbiologist living in Seattle, and she also wrote a book on scientists as activists. Barker says she's never seen anything like the March for Science before.
No, I think this is pretty unusual.
She's been an activist for decades, and she says unusual is good. She participated in Seattle's March for Science a few weeks ago, and she's encouraged that the movement has kept going more than a year after the inauguration. But she's also concerned that things may be going too far.
It's become a very partisan issue. And there's a group who have taken off on the March for Science, and they're trying to get Democratic scientists elected.
And that can have repercussions. A recent study published in the Journal of Environmental Communication shows that the public sees scientists who advocate for specific policies as less credible. But at the same time, a survey by the Pew Research Center shows public confidence in scientists has remained stable for decades. It's confusing. Do you get involved in politics, go out and protest, or just stay in the lab and work? I went to New Jersey to find out.
Hey, Bo?
Yes.
Wow, hi.
Nice to meet you.
Great to meet you. Come in.
That's Ariana Chatalos. She's a conservation ecologist at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. She's also a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists, an organization that takes part in rallies, protests, and also lobbies politicians. She says scientists need to do all of that.
This is something I'm doing for me and for the future of humanity and for Earth. So it's not just about politics. It doesn't stop when you publish your paper. It doesn't stop when you clock out at 5 p.m.
Chatalos says she involved herself in activism when people started questioning her research. In the same way, President Trump questions the science behind climate change.
I work with construction officials who are proposing to build in an environmentally sensitive area. And when our regulations are inconvenient, they will very much, I've seen this, piggyback on the idea of, well, you don't know that science is actually right.
Edgardo Sanabria Valentin has seen this kind of reaction too. He's a biology professor at John Jay College, and he was also at the March for Science in New York. He says the reason that so many scientists are turning to activism is because almost everyone's work is being threatened.
The threat of censorship, the threat of budget cuts shook up most of the scientific community, and they're realizing that, we cannot just be in our benches doing our experiments. We have to get out there. We have to get the message out, and it is our responsibility.
He's encouraged by the amount of people showing up to defend and support scientists, but he's worried that the movement may be running out of momentum.
I just hope that people don't get too exhausted, and please remember there are elections every year, not just on presidential elections.
The White House did not respond to multiple requests for comment. Bo Hamby, Columbia Radio News.
And now for the next in our commentary series. Eileen Grench, our resident Olympian, reflects on the thin line between failure and success.
So you know that moment when you're sitting next to some stranger on a bus or a plane and they ask you what you do? For 18 years of my life, I dreaded this question. Moments after I admitted I was a professional fencer, the second inevitable question always was, did you go to the Olympics? When I'd say no, they would mumble some version of a disappointed, oh, and put their headphones back in. I failed to make the Olympics 3 times. In 2008, I failed to qualify by 3 spots. In 2012, I lost by 1 point, total fail. And here's something that wasn't in my Columbia Journalism School application. In 2016, I failed too. I lost in the gold medal bout of the Olympic qualifier and spent the next 2 months shaking, crying, working as a secretary, and eating a lot of Chinese takeout. That's 12 years of failing, if that's how you want to look at it. Psychologically, the sport is already tough. Losing in tennis, pretty bad. Losing in fencing, someone just beat you with a metal rod 15 times. And then the winner tears their mask off, hair flying, and lets out a primal roar of victory, oftentimes straight in the loser's face. So imagine that moment in the final Olympic qualifier in 2016. I was in front of my teammates, my coach, and all the people who had supported me. And I lost. And of course, my opponent did this. That scream haunts my dreams. So, you all know the end of the story. I did make it to the Olympics, and I did win a match, and as I always thought, I was able to prove I deserved to be there. In a strange twist of fate, the woman who beat me was banned from competition, and I was next in line. Over the course of my career, I did win international medals. I also strained my bank account, my marriage, my friendships, in order to pursue this single goal. And now I have it, the title of Olympian, and I'm very proud to wear it. But here's the thing. Those who didn't make it made just as many of the lauded Olympic sacrifices I did. And now, when I hear people call me an Olympian, I think, I'm proud, but I'm no different than before. I was an almost. My life has had big changes. These days, when I'm on a plane and they ask me the same question, I get to say, yes, I was in Rio, with a stupid grin on my face. Now they react differently. Wow, they say, and pause again before asking, did you win a medal? No, I say, just before they put their headphones back on.
Eileen is still saving up for her Olympic tattoo and taking donations. Look her up on Venmo. This is Uptown Radio. I'm Colin Marston.
And I'm Wendy Rhodes. Don't go anywhere. There's more to come after this break. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Wendy Rhodes.
And I'm Colin Marston.
Coming up, the Sikh community is preparing for a parade down Fifth Avenue to celebrate their religion and culture.
And New York City is expanding its curbside composting program, but environmentalists are worried that it may not be enough.
These stories and more, but first, let's get to the news.
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Juliette Jepkiro. President Trump received Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel at the White House today. She's in town to lobby the president, and she agreed with him on at least one point. The Iran nuclear deal is only a first step to curb Tehran's nuclear ambitions. And as we've just heard, the president remained hardline in his public comments.
Violence, bloodshed, and chaos all across the Middle East.
Despite Merkel's visit today and Macron's one earlier this week, Trump is still expected to pull out of the multinational Iran nuclear deal by May 12. The German chancellor didn't change the president's mind on trade. The U.S. tariffs on European steel and aluminum products should kick in on May 1st. Violence continues in Gaza. Today, hundreds of Palestinian protesters charged the fence that separates Israel from the Gaza Strip. Israeli troops responded by firing at the crowd. 3 people were killed, and an Israeli newspaper reported that more than 800 were wounded. This was the 5th straight week of demonstrations in a series billed as the Great Return March. It's meant to denounce the Israeli blockade of the enclave that has been going on for the past decade. 40 demonstrators were killed in the first 4 weekly protests. T-Mobile and Sprint could be merging as soon as this weekend. That would create the third largest wireless carrier in the United States with more than 120 million customers. Reportedly, the two companies are still finalizing details of a deal, but nothing is confirmed yet. The White House Correspondents' Dinner will take place tomorrow night, but President Trump will not attend, continuing his boycott. Tonight will be quite cloudy and a little rainy in New York, with temperatures between 51 and 55 degrees. Maybe a reason to stay inside and to listen to the new songs the Swedish band ABBA released today for the first time in 35 years. Juliette Jepkiro, Columbia Radio News.
Janelle Monáe, a genre-defying singer and songwriter, is coming out with a new album today titled Dirty Computer, and it's generating buzz on social media. And she just came out as pansexual. More on that later.
I spoke with Rolling Stone staff writer Brittany Spanos, who just published a profile of the singer yesterday. Monáe is on the cover of May's Issue, and the new album is her first new piece of music in the last 5 years. In the meantime, she starred in films and been an outspoken activist about racial justice. I asked Spanos about what Monáe has been up to lately and what her album is really about.
I feel like it's a love story about Janelle Monáe re-falling in love with all of her flaws and learning to really love herself as a dirty computer. She puts it as a flawed human being was really important. I think it's very clear in the album, just like the idea of accepting all of that and accepting the whole picture of who you are.
Janelle Monáe has made overtures throughout her work to being queer or being bisexual, but it seems that with this latest album, she's really making a statement. What is the significance of that, do you think? I mean, the Webster Dictionary's most searched term for yesterday was pansexual due to your piece.
So what's really beautiful about the understanding of how she presents her queerness and how she presents herself as a dirty computer is that there is a political undertone to all that. There is this nature of we are fighting against the people who want to clean us and the people that want to make us feel less human than we are.
Your piece travels from where Monáe grew up in Kansas City to her studio Wonderland in Atlanta. What did you learn about her as a person?
Getting the opportunity to see her both in Wonderland, which is such a wonderful community. I mean, seeing everyone go in and out the way that they are, really a family there, was really beautiful. But then getting to actually meet so much of her family, to meet both of her parents and to meet her great-grandma and her aunts and her uncles. Yeah, I think just kind of seeing how that informed her and seeing how that sort of built the Janelle Monáe that we know today was really inspiring.
And do you think that this album may mark a turning point to her becoming a cultural icon like her mentor Prince?
I think she was already well on her way, even without this. I think that she had this has continued such a hot streak of albums. And I think this is definitely a moment of solidifying and also being able to solidify it with a very honest portrayal of her own self and of her own life and her own views. I think that's really remarkable. And I do think this will be considered one of her best works.
And if you had to choose, I know this might be difficult, but what is your favorite song on the album?
I am really in love with Don't Judge Me. I think it's just her delivery on that is just kind of like really sensual and beautiful and also really vulnerable, and there's kind of a sadness to it. So that one's really grown on me, but I do still also really love Crazy Classic Life. I'm happy that it's out now, so my friends are all obsessed with it. We can all kind of like listen to it together all summer, so yeah.
That was Brittany Spanos, staff writer at Rolling Stones magazine. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Invasive species, destructive plants and animals that hitched rides here on boats, planes, and even people, then multiplied and in some cases took over.
And like other states, New York has had little success fighting them, but groundbreaking new technology might change that. My co-host Wendy Rhodes reports.
They're everywhere. Burrowing beetles that kill trees by the hundreds of millions,
slimy, parasitic fish that suck the life out of their prey, noxious weeds that cause painful blisters and permanent scarring, and the dreaded feathery little birds? Well, yeah. European starlings nest together on buildings and can leave droppings over a foot deep. Droppings that make 1 million Americans ill each year from E. coli and salmonella. The starlings are also responsible for agricultural damage to the tune of almost $1 billion annually in the U.S. They ravage berry fields and eat grain meant for livestock. They fly in huge flocks, the second largest of all birds, with numbers from the tens of thousands to over 1 million. And with that many birds, damage can happen quickly.
They are an invasive species, which is detrimental to crops in certain areas. They can fly into aircraft, which is not good. They also carry diseases.
Dr. Julia Zachello is a scientist at the American Museum of Natural History. She's studied European starlings for years. We're walking down Columbus Avenue on a sunny Saturday morning, hoping to spot some starlings.
They're dark, but they have a lot of purple and green in their feathers. They're trying to attract mates and look beautiful, which they really do.
We spot some almost instantly, hopping on a grassy patch in the median and poking their beaks into the dirt looking for bugs to eat.
Is that one right there?
Yeah, that's one right there.
European starlings were first brought to the U.S. in 1890 when 60 of them were released in Manhattan's Central Park. The birds came for the bard. Birds appear in many of Shakespeare's plays, like starlings in Henry IV. A well-meaning Shakespeare lover released the starlings into the park so audiences at the outdoor performances could have the complete Shakespeare experience. Fast forward 125 years.
The birds have expanded across the United States extremely rapidly, and now we have almost 200 million starlings just from that one invasion.
According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, European starlings are one of the most invasive birds in the United States because of their ability to reproduce quickly and thrive in a variety of environments. Farmers to wildlife managers have attempted to control the starlings by cutting down the trees they nest in and even shooting and poisoning them. But these methods have little impact, so scientists are looking to new technology for answers. Like Samuel Sternberg. He teaches biochemistry and molecular biophysics at Columbia University Medical Center. He's at the forefront of a new technology called CRISPR.
We just moved in here about a month ago. We can do biochemical experiments here, so we'll probably have a radioactive bench over here where we'll do some functional tests of different CRISPR enzymes.
Sternberg's new lab is being designed to study CRISPR technology. CRISPR is a new form of gene editing that can change the DNA of plants, animals, even humans. Sternberg explains it as we make our way to his office.
Gene editing sounds very easy when you just say gene editing, but actually what you're asking is a protein, this CRISPR machine, to find one stretch of DNA in a side of a human cell that has 3 billion letters of DNA.
That precision can make CRISPR more accurate and less expensive than other gene editing technologies, and as a result, more attractive to scientists looking to use it to control invasive species. Sternberg explains the power of CRISPR in a 2017 book he co-authored, A Crack in Creation, Gene Editing and the Unthinkable Power to Control Evolution. Wait, control evolution?
CRISPR gives you the power to rewrite genetic code and to do so in a heritable way. And so you really can reshape the genome, which is what makes everything in nature the way that it is.
So, yes, control evolution. And despite his enthusiasm for CRISPR, Sternberg has some concerns about its readiness as a control method for invasive birds.
It might also spread beyond our control, and if it turns out to have unintended consequences that we're not aware of right now, they'd be very difficult to recall because of this ability to spread without human intervention once they're released.
Those unintended consequences, juxtaposed with the excitement about CRISPR's potential benefits, have prompted flip-flopping within the scientific community. Scientists at Harvard and MIT who published a paper in support of CRISPR now say we should put on the brakes until further testing is done, while a scientist at Columbia who published a paper warning of the serious consequences of CRISPR formally withdrew it and now supports the technology. But in Western Australia, invasive species are such a big problem, the state government says the potential benefits are worth the risk. And it says Australia may be in the perfect location to test this theory out.
Australia is in a fairly good location to consider using gene drives for these forms of wildlife management because we're an island nation.
Dorian Morrow is a biodiversity and conservation scientist with the Western Australian state government. He says invasive species are wiping out native plants and animals and throwing off the delicate balance of the environment. So he's looking to CRISPR to modify the DNA of invasive species like European starlings.
So the result is that a selected trait, or genetic trait, for example, sex determination or maleness, can be promoted in a population more rapidly than would normally happen.
More male starlings would mean fewer female starlings, and as a result, fewer offspring.
And that's the beauty of population control, because using CRISPR, if it does work, is that there's no need then to cull or bait with poisons.
Poison that every scientist I spoke with for this story says is cruel. And it kills indiscriminately, not just its target, the starlings. And it doesn't put much of a dent in the bird's giant population anyway. Because of all of this, Morrow says the rewards of CRISPR outweigh the risks.
And I think that's the excitement about it. It's we don't want to just stand back and be complacent and do nothing.
But not everyone agrees that European starlings need to be controlled at all, at least not in New York. Julia Zachello, the scientist with the American Museum of Natural History, says starlings have become an integral part of our ecosystem.
They've been here for a long time, and since their population is so large, they certainly have a role and a distinct niche. And so removing that would be potentially a dramatic effect.
Besides, the starlings eat bugs like beetles, flies, and snails, which Zachello says is more helpful than what some invasive species do.
When I think about invasive species and the damage that they can do, I've often thought, humans are an invasive species, and we do more damage probably than the starlings themselves.
While the debate over the starling's future continues, there's another pest that Zachello, Morrow, and Sternberg all have their eyes on now: the mosquito. They say CRISPR technology could soon transform mosquitoes so that they can no longer transmit malaria, one of the world's deadliest diseases. For now, European starlings are safe. Scientists say CRISPR will not be ready for widespread use on invasive birds for several years. Wendy Rhodes, Columbia Radio News. New York City has a lot of waste, and most of it is food waste. Last year, the Department of Sanitation collected nearly 30,000 tons of banana peels, coffee grounds, and old wilted lettuce.
And the city is expanding its composting program, but not mandating it. If it did, it would be collecting 40 times as much. As the program stands now, few people are participating, and environmentalists are hoping to get that number up. Mira Gable reports.
Every Wednesday for the last 2 years, Melinda Moore has been dropping off her food scraps in one of the 9 gray bins on the far east side of Union Square. Opening up a plastic bag, she describes what's inside.
Let's see, some red cabbage I used to make tacos, some alfalfa sprouts I sprouted in my kitchen.
These gray bins are not meant for your empty coffee cup. Inside, you'll find banana peels, brown eggshells, or even a perfectly edible head of broccoli. These are compost bins. For more, composting just makes sense.
I'd been reading zero waste blogs, and I was like, why don't I just do this? And so I always have an appointment in Union Square on Wednesdays, so I just make it part of my routine to drop it off on Wednesdays.
And that's where Angel Gonzalez comes in. At 11 a.m. every day, he picks up the gray compost bins from Union Square and drives them to the Lower East Side Ecology Center, one of nearly a dozen facilities in the city that processes food waste.
I basically process a lot of the material that we get from all our food scrap drop-off sites around the city.
The facility's compost yard is located at the bottom of Manhattan, just over the freeway on the waterfront. In the middle, there's a line of 5-foot-tall white bins. He dumps the gray bins into the white bins, and out fall rotten apples, moldy oranges, and pizza crusts. And it smells.
We also mix the sawdust within the food scraps, and it helps dramatically to break down the food scraps.
After about 3 weeks of decaying, the mixture of food scraps, wood chips, and sawdust turns into what Gonzalez calls black gold, a soil mixture with loads of nutrition. He then piles the black gold into large mounds, which just looks like black dirt. You wouldn't even know it was once food. It's then packaged and then given to city parks, urban farms, and community gardens. Jean Bonadel is the director of Cornell's Waste Management Institute. She says compost can be easily utilized, but New Yorkers have an out-of-sight, out-of-mind philosophy when it comes to trash. And they don't really see why composting is essential for a city made mostly of concrete.
Composting is an important issue because organics are a resource. If we put them in a landfill, they're not doing us any good. But if we can capture those and get them into a compost facility, then that soil amendment goes back to the soil and grows more food for us.
She says not only does composting enrich the soil, but it's simple and something anyone can do right now. But since the city does not yet enforce composting, environmentalists are trying to get more people to join voluntary programs. Marissa DiDominicus is the executive director of Earth Matter, an environmental advocacy group focused on composting. She agrees that composting is a no-brainer, but she says that just providing a curbside bin may not be enough to motivate New Yorkers to actually use them.
I think that people aren't going to do anything that is not easy for them, and so this is like another hurdle for them, just like recycling. Oh, you mean there's a separate container for a plastic bottle than for a paper bag?
DiDominicus says getting all New Yorkers to compost their leftover Chinese food instead of just simply throwing it out has not been easy. Cities like San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle have mandated composting, but the populations of those three cities combined barely adds up to those of Brooklyn and Queens. To increase exposure, Earth Matter, along with the Department of Sanitation, has set up compost drop-off bins within 0.5 miles of every home in the city.
We do need more infrastructure because there's a brown bin there. There's not necessarily the education that goes along with it.
The city requires that buildings collect paper, plastic, and glass, but has left the composting program voluntary. As the program stands now, less than 0.25% of the food waste we can be diverting is actually being collected and sent to local compost facilities. Department of Sanitation spokeswoman Belinda Mager said every New Yorker will have a curbside compost bin by the end of the year, but she didn't mention how the city plans to expand in the future.
It's a voluntary program. The curbside program is available to 3.3 million city residents, not all 8 million like the regular recycling programs are like paper, metal, glass, and plastic. So it is a voluntary program right now.
Jane Critney is the coordinator of the Zero Waste program on Governor's Island. She says it's going to take city regulation, education, and mandates to get New Yorkers to compost on a broader level.
Whoever cares is going to make the move, whether it's a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach. I think both are equally as important in moving the needle.
Back at Union Square, Stanley Sherman cares. He's heard about the city's compost expansion. He's hopeful, and he thinks it wouldn't take much to get skeptics on board.
Definitely not too big of a venture. Once people start, it becomes a routine, and if it's curbside, it's real easy.
Sherman says he's excited to get a bin in his building, but until then, he will walk the 4 blocks to drop off his compost at Union Square 3 times a week. Mira Gable, Columbia Radio News.
This Saturday, the Sikh community will be marching down the streets of Manhattan in their annual New York City parade. The Sikhs are a religious minority from India, instantly identifiable by the turbans that they wear.
The parade is a religious and cultural celebration. There will be music and free vegetarian meals. But participants are also hoping the parade will help change the perceptions of their community, long plagued by suspicion and bias in America. Eileen Grench reports.
Outside the Gurdwara in South Richmond, Queens, it's raining and a bit gloomy. Inside is a different story. Downstairs from the main area of worship, the kitchen is crowded. In the center of the room is a 5-foot-high heap of spinach and mustard greens. Men in turbans are stirring giant vats of dal and sog with mallets the size of shovels. Women sit on the floor chopping cabbage or stand, patting bread dough into flat, round discs, which the men throw into the fire. They're cooking free meals for the over 15,000 people they want to feed at the parade tomorrow. And the community is giving it all away for free. Mr. Singh, a leader at the Gurdwara, says that serving free food is an important reminder of the Sikh belief in equality.
You just come in and you eat like everybody else, same food. It doesn't matter, you can be a millionaire, a billionaire, it doesn't matter. And that is what Sikhism teaches you, the equality, not in theory, but practically.
But these aren't easy times for the Sikh community. Hate crimes against Sikhs rose sharply after 9/11, and again after the 2016 presidential election. Singh says he has been on the receiving end of bigotry.
Yeah, I have been called Osama bin Laden a million times, maybe more than that.
But he also sees signs of positive change. Hoboken just elected a Sikh mayor, Mayor Bala. He will be marching in the parade tomorrow along with everyone else, celebrating new strides the Sikh community has made in New York. In 2016, the city began allowing officers to wear their turbans on duty. And although there was an uptick in hate crimes this year, Singh remains optimistic.
Yeah, there is always uptick back and forth, and this election has been a really hard one for us, no doubt about it. But at the same time, it runs in our genes that we don't give up.
The Sikh parade begins tomorrow at 11 a.m. They will march from 50th and Madison to 23rd Street, where they will be serving the free meals. Eileen Grench, Columbia Radio News.
The subway is in crisis. Blah, blah, blah. This we know. It's routinely plagued with delays. And let's not get started with its antiquated signal system. This morning at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Manhattan, transit experts gathered to talk about all the subway's problems.
Andy Byford has been president of the New York City Transit Authority for 101 days. He promised that a new plan to radically improve the subway will be coming within the next month. Augusta Anthony reports.
We're in the Grand Ballroom of the Grand Hyatt opposite Grand Central Station in New York, and Andy Byford has a grand plan.
The rock star, Andy Byford. Andy? Good morning, everyone.
Today he's announcing big changes for New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, this plan will be no mere tweak of what we currently do. It is a full-blown NYCT renaissance.
But we'll have to wait for details. After his speech, as the waiters cleared coffee cups, he said he acknowledged the mammoth task ahead.
Have you regretted your decision to take this on at all?
Not once. I'm loving every minute of it.
He wants to push forward with 4 major priorities: revolutionizing the subway, reimagining the buses, creating an accessible system, and transforming the culture of the MTA.
And I intend to pull them together into a full-on plan, a modernization plan. We simply have to bite that bullet.
Sounds great, but there's a caveat. Some of New York's signals date from before the Second World War. Byford says overhauling the system could mean closing the subways on weekends and overnight.
One weekend closure, you could get the equivalent of 5 weeks' worth of nights work undertaken. So for me, the gain is worth the pain.
Stuart Mader is president of the Path Riders Council. He agrees with Byford that sacrifices are necessary.
People have been focused more on mending than on transforming. It will involve some pain and disruption to your normal routines, but that is necessary to deliver a fundamentally better experience and to bring New York back to a place where we're on par with London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, other global cities, our peers.
But sticking in New York for now, across the road at Grand Central, subway rider Jason Oberfeld doesn't mind potential closures.
I understand when you're upgrading infrastructure, what it takes. It's not as easy as just doing it while everything remains active.
But his commute is during the day. For Julie Martinez from the Bronx, nighttime closures would be a disaster.
I'm working late, so like 1 a.m., 2 a.m., so it's hard. I don't know how I would be able to get home knowing that they're going to shut off the trains.
And Martinez wants more for her money.
For $2.75 a ride, you know, we deserve a lot more than what we get now. So in order for us to sacrifice more, it's kind of ridiculous to hear.
Byford says he will announce the plan in mid to late May. Augusta Anthony, Columbia Radio News.
To end our show, we turn to reporter Dan Rabb. He tells us how learning to embrace change meant giving up something very valuable to him.
Moving from Boston to New York shouldn't have felt like a big deal. It was an opportunity for my wife and I to advance our careers. I was born and raised in Boston, but I had lots of friends in New York, and I was here all the time for work anyway. To be fair, New York has treated me well in the year since I made the move 300 miles south. But more than I care to admit, I find myself thinking about what I sacrificed to come here. There's this constant ache that I gave up something I may never be able to get back, something precious. Two things, actually. A pair of faded red plastic chairs, seats 5 and 6 in row NN, section 95, in the right field grandstand at Fenway Park. You're not supposed to just give up your Red Sox season tickets. They're sacred objects, handed down from generation to generation. And you can't just buy them. Someone has to either die or do the unthinkable, give them up. I had to put my name on a wait list when I was in middle school, and I got lucky. The Red Sox called when I was nearly 30, 15 years later. Sox tickets aren't cheap. Even mine, way out in right field and angled so sharply towards center that you spend all game looking over your left shoulder. I'll spare myself the embarrassment of laying out the math here, but these tickets were not a responsible financial choice. Think 2 months' rent on a Manhattan apartment. Still, the thought of turning them down never crossed my mind. Those 2 seats meant far more than just the pleasure of watching baseball and drinking beer at every home game. Although, believe me, that was great. And it wasn't just that the team's fortunes take up a higher percentage of my emotional bandwidth than I care to admit. When I got off that wait list 5 years ago, it was confirmation that I had built the life I had imagined since childhood in Boston. I was living in a building I had pictured myself living in when I walked by its fountain on my way to school decades earlier. I was hanging out with many of the same high school friends as when I put my name on that wait list all those years ago. Maybe this sounds terrible to some, a stagnant existence. But there's comfort in the illusion that things will never change, that life can turn out exactly the way you imagine. The Red Sox were central to this illusion. How many things that you and your friends love at 13 do you still love at 33? My season tickets felt like assurance that there are some things you can hold on to forever. But when I met my wife, not a Boston native, all of a sudden, the visions I'd held on to since childhood had to be shared with her dreams and aspirations. And while it hurt, the decision to give up the tickets and move for her career was just as much of a no-brainer as buying the seats in the first place. My life in Boston was comfortable and effortless, but leaving that cocoon of familiarity has given me perspective and freedom. I'm about to finish a graduate degree and looking at jobs all over the world. The future seems wide open, and that's a good thing, even if it feels like I'm losing a bit of myself in the process. That said, I have a confession. Last month, I called the Red Sox, and I put my name back on the wait list. I figure if it takes another 20 years, I'll be 50 when I'm a season ticket holder again. And hopefully I'll be able to walk to Fenway with my kids, the way I always hoped I would. Maybe I'll even pass my seats along to them. But I'll make sure they know that if they give them away, that's okay too.
Dan Rabb wants to clarify that this new embrace of change does not expend to supporting the Yankees. Ever. And that's our show for this Friday, April 27th. I'm Wendy Rhodes.
And I'm Colin Marston. A great team put this show together every week. Our editors were Juan Torres Falcon and Mira Gable. Our producers were Madeline Thompson and Stevie Hertz. Sarah Wyman was executive producer.
Director Cassiana McClenahan led our studio team, along with Dan Rabb and Elisa Escarce. Bo Hamby got this stream live to the web. Radio professionals Deb Amos, Sally Herships, Gilda Jacarli, and Ben Shapiro advised our support staff, with support from Carrie Donahue.
Thanks for heading into your weekend with Uptown Radio. We're live every Friday at 4. In the meantime, you can always find us on the web at uptownradio.org.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast wherever you get them.
See you next week.